Good morning, Green Spring. Today is Thursday, August 28. I'm Elke Martin, your host, and I have an exciting program for you. I'm excited to be here with State Senator George Barker. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And Marvin, I don't even know your last name. Wagner, yes. And I just found out it's his birthday today, so if you run into him today, make sure you say happy birthday to Marvin.
Thank you.
We are here to talk about gerrymandering, which is a problem in many places in this country, but we were going to focus on Virginia because it's has been a serious problem here for a while. And we have to congratulate the senator for passing a bill. Well, you didn't just pass it by yourself, obviously, but it's your bill, right?
It's actually a constitutional amendment.
Oh,
and
well.
It was my proposal that was passed.
Yeah.
Obviously, I had a lot of help on it and worked with people to get it done. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad about it.
Yes.
And we're going to hear more about that in a minute. I think Marvin wants to tell us a little bit about the history of gerrymandering.
Right. A lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with what it is, and the definition of gerrymandering is, one, to divide a voting area to give one political party a majority in as many districts as possible. So to create districts to assist one political party as opposed to the other. The second part is to manipulate unfairly to gain an advantage. It's really an old tactic. It's been around for a long time. The first time it was by Elbridge Gerry, his name was Gerry, who was a governor of Massachusetts.
Well, that's where the name comes from, right?
That's right,
Yes.
exactly. And it was the method was employed in 1812. So it's over 200 years that they've been using this tactic.
And we see it sometimes when we look at the map of Virginia and look at the different voting districts. Some of them have an odd shape. And these days, I think people have gotten to refine the methods of finding pockets here and there so that the voting turns out in favor of this or that party because of all the technical advances, right? Technological advances.
Yes.
Before I came to Green Spring, I was living down in Fredericksburg. And the first congressional district goes from Loudoun County, or even before, well, all the way down to Williamsburg. It's like 40 miles. It's a thin strip. That's a perfect example of gerrymandering a congressional district.
If I remember correctly, it's supposed to be compact and
contiguous.
Contiguous,
Yes.
Two words,
Good.
right?
Yeah.
Compact and contiguous. Yeah, not always according to the words, how it
Yes.
is these days. So what are we doing about this?
We
Well,
are. Go ahead.
If I might, I prepared a couple of things to show the listeners on how it physically works. And here we have an example of an area, and in the middle they have a large concentration of voters for one political party. And then normally you would take this area and you would divide it into 4 separate
Quadrants.
districts. And as you can see, I don't know how well you can see it, it would represent 50% for each of the particular parties, even though there's a large concentration of voters in one area.
Yeah.
Now, what they do to change this would be the fair way of doing it. They would create a district in the middle so that all of the voters of this one political party would be in that one district, and then create 3 districts surrounding it, 3 of which would then be favorable to the other party.
Right.
So instead of having a 50-50 situation, you have 3 districts that are going to go for one party and 1 district that they'll let go to the other. So this is a perfect example of how gerrymandering works.
And we have to say that both parties have done some of
Yes.
this.
Oh, yes.
Oh yes, Maryland
Yeah.
is another example of gerrymandering in favor of Democrats. Virginia is an example of gerrymandering in favor of Republicans.
At this time, absolutely,
right.
yeah. So, Senator, what have you done in your work around this?
Well, I've been working on this for many years, and actually I was heavily involved in doing the redistricting in 2011 for the state Senate seats. And we came up with a plan that was balanced overall, so in the Senate.
So that happens every 10 years,
Every 10
correct?
years.
After
The census is done in a year ending in 0.
Right.
In the next year, although the census date is April 1 of 2020, for example, next year, we won't get the data from that until at least February of 2021. So then we have to fairly quickly then draw the districts.
Yeah.
Last time, actually, we had maps that were drawn. The governor vetoed the bill. So we had to go back and make some changes and get it to be something that he would sign.
And when you say we, that is who?
Basically, the legislators themselves have always done it. And actually, the way it works in Virginia, or the way it has worked in Virginia, is the House of Delegates members, such as Delegate Watts, they draw the districts for the House of Delegates, and the state senators have drawn the districts for the state Senate districts. And then there's been some meeting of the minds in drawing the congressional districts. So there are 3 maps that we have to draw to be able to have the elections set up with basically equal numbers of people in each district.
Now, why wouldn't you just have one way of defining districts, and then everybody has to go with that map?
Well, you wouldn't because there are different numbers of districts for the different kinds. So, for example, we have 11 congressional districts. So you have to have about 730,000 people in each congressional district. We did in 2011, based upon the 2010 census, because we had 8 million people. In the House of Delegates, you have 100 seats.
Yeah.
So you took the 8 million people, and so you had to draw districts of about 80,000 each. For the Senate, there are 40 senators. And so we each have 200,000 people, basically, in our district.
Yeah.
So we had to draw different districts for different numbers of people to represent you. So.
Yeah. And
so we did that in 2011.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we drew the 3 maps: the state Senate districts, the House of Delegates districts, and the congressional districts. And the Democrats, we were in control. I'm a Democrat. We were in control in the Senate, so we worked with the Republicans and drew a map that was basically, the map that we initially proposed was regarded as the fairest of all, because we had drawn 20 seats that were more Democratic than the average, 20 seats that were more Republican than the statewide average, and so it was balanced there. In the end, we had to make a little shift, so there are 21 that are more Republican and 19 that are more Democratic, and this is real politics here.
Yeah.
Because right now, what we have is we have 21 Republicans in their 21 districts that are more Republican. We have 19 Democrats in the 19 districts that are more Democratic.
Yeah.
So it does have real implications there, and that's why what Marvin was showing you has a real effect on things. That's how you do it. Interestingly, all 3 maps got challenged in court. The map that we drew in the state Senate for our districts was upheld in court, so there's no problem with our map. The other 2 maps, however, eventually were overturned by the courts. And they were overturned basically because of racial gerrymandering.
Yes.
What the Republicans had done for both the House of Delegates and for the congressional districts was find as many African Americans as they could in the Richmond area and in the Hampton Roads area, Norfolk, Newport News, Hampton, Virginia Beach, that area, and put as many African Americans in as few districts as possible.
Yeah.
To make them
and let
heavily
those districts go to one party.
Yeah, so
and
those
then
districts then became all Democratic,
rest,
and then they, organized it so that they were winning all the seats around those districts.
Yeah.
And the courts, the federal courts, threw both of those maps out. They did the congressional one was done in 2015, and the House of Delegates map was thrown out last year. So we they had to redraw the districts, and in the end, the courts ended up redrawing it because the legislature couldn't agree on things, so it went to the courts. And what they did was they drew it so that where there was only one majority African American seat where African American voters could control the outcome for Congress, now there are 2. And interestingly, things have changed in Virginia. It used to be that it was argued that for African Americans to be able to control the outcome in a district,
Yeah.
they would need to have 55, 60% African American population to control the outcome. Now the data show that because the voting no longer breaks it solidly along racial lines, all you have to have is about 35 to 40% in the area that was affected here. So what you have is neither of the two congressional districts that are controlled by African American voters, and both of them do have an African American as their congressman now. Neither of those districts has 50% African American population, but they're still controlled by them because if African Americans are largely united behind one candidate, whether it's a primary or general election, there will be enough other people who will vote for that candidate that they will win.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have this year the maps were redrawn for the House of Delegates. So it does not affect anything in Northern Virginia. So Delegate Watts still has the same district that she's had all decade, but it does affect about 1/4 of the districts statewide, 26 out of the 100. And they're all
26 out of 100. Yeah, that's
have new
noticeable,
boundaries.
Yes.
And this will be just the only election for those with these new boundaries, because in 2021 we'll have more census data and we'll make the changes ourselves. But the changes are all occurring in the Richmond and Hampton Roads area, so it's in that part of the Commonwealth.
Oh, so that's one reason we want to watch that this year, the
Yes.
elections. That's interesting.
But actually what I've been working on over the last several years is coming up with a way where it's not just one political party's legislators who are making the decisions on things.
Yes, what a relief.
And we've been actually working on it for about 10 or 12 years, ever since I got elected. And I've put in a little different variations of proposals and worked with both Republicans and Democrats to try to make it fair. Until this year, we had never been able to get enough consensus behind any one particular proposal to get it passed. But this year, we did pass a constitutional amendment that will set up a commission to draw the districts. And that commission will have 8 legislators, 4 of whom are Republican, 4 of whom are Democrat, and 8 citizens. And the 8 citizens
who chooses the citizens is
good
the
question. Good question. The citizens will be nominated by legislators, but the choosing of the citizens, and most of the ones nominated won't be on the final panel, but those on the final panel will be selected by retired circuit court judges. So it's people who've been through the political process and sort of understand things and will clearly have to work together to provide balance on the citizens who are over there and make sure we have competent people who can really make the good decisions there.
So the commission will have 16 members?
16 members.
Oh, why did you choose an even number?
Well, we wanted to sort of make it even we wanted to make everything as even as possible. Because the one thing you don't want to do when you're doing redistricting is give somebody a political advantage. And so, for example, having 4 of each party is better than having 5 of one and 4 of the other.
Of course,
yes. So we did that.
You don't think you could find one independent person in Virginia?
Well, there are some.
Because it's easier. I mean, if you're looking for a decision, it's easier when you have an uneven number, right?
Well, let's put it this way: we could find somebody who says, "I am an independent." If you wanted to make it say 9 citizens,
but you wouldn't believe them.
But necessarily you should. But especially, you should not believe them. So you need to be skeptical in those situations, and so that's why we set it up as 8 and 8. Citizens and legislators. And we also set it up so that no entity no political party or no group can feel that they got the short end of the stick. So to pass the maps, you have to have 6 of the 8 legislators vote for it and 6 of the 8 citizens vote for it. So you could have every legislator vote for it, but if you don't get 6 of the citizens to vote for it, it doesn't go forward. You could have all the citizens in favor of something, but if you don't get 6 of the legislators. And part of the reason we did 6 rather than 5 is if you did 5, it would be rather tempting for both political parties to try to get one of the 4 from the other political party to side with them.
Yeah.
And we wanted to protect against that, so that's why we said 6 rather than 5 to have to vote for something there. And that way you have to have at least 2 of each political party of the legislators, and you have to have 6 of the 8 citizens. So a pretty broad consensus. So at a minimum, you'd have to have at least 12 of the 16 members voting for something. So it's a significant majority. So that way, Republicans can't lose out, Democrats can't lose out, the legislators can't freeze the citizens out, and the citizens can't freeze the legislators out.
Now, when George explained that to us at one of our meetings, I said, but George, what if the Republicans got together and said, we're not going to vote for it, or the Democrats, and then you're not going to get your 6?
Right.
What do you do then?
Yes. What would happen then is, in the end, there would be an opportunity for a second chance. But in the end, if you can't reach it, it goes to the state Supreme Court. Which, and courts all across the country, historically, that's how things are decided. So, for example, if we couldn't decide something within the legislature in the past, it would have gone actually first to a circuit court and then to the Supreme Court. We've set it up so it goes just straight to the Supreme Court, because there's not a lot of time in Virginia, since we have House of Delegate elections in 2021.
Right.
So the same year. So the same year you finally get the data. So there's not really a good opportunity to drag it out.
Right. If you say you don't get the data till February,
right.
and the primary will be in June
Well,
or something?
the primary is usually in June, but actually when it's a redistricting year, the primary gets moved to August.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, for example,
So you have a little bit of
so you have a little bit of time there to do it. But we set it up so that it goes through the commission, and the commission will will draw the maps. That then is submitted to the state legislature, and the legislature then has to vote it up or down. They don't get to make any amendments. So it's just an up or down vote on the legislative maps and on the congressional maps. The reason we did that is that there is a provision in the U.S. Constitution that says that the drawing of the congressional districts shall be the purview of the state legislatures.
I see.
And so if we have a commission, we would not be in compliance with that.
Yeah.
And Chief Justice Roberts on the Supreme Court has already indicated he thinks these commissions generally are not constitutional.
Oh, really?
Yes.
The commission in California
Yes.
is not constitutional.
Right.
Really?
And so it's going to be interesting to see whether there is a court decision. But
Yeah.
I didn't want to put us in a position where we would do a good job,
Right.
but then we get thrown out because of
Yeah.
that one section of the Constitution.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
What
Well,
section is that?
Yeah.
But you still do the work
Yes.
in the commission.
Yeah, we
and
still
get
do all
to
the work. Yes. Agreement. Yes.
So that,
Right. And we
and
don't,
that's why it's only an
yeah.
up and down vote.
It's just a straight up or down vote.
Yeah.
And for example, if either the House or the Senate voted it down, it would go back to the commission for a redraw, but you only get 2 shots at it because we have to move fast to be ready for a primary in August. So it's an interesting proposal, and it was an interesting process to get us there.
I bet. Do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, because there were mine was not the only proposal. So there was one other major proposal and a couple other minor proposals that were made. But what I did was I worked with both Democrats and Republicans in the state Senate to say, what do you need to make sure that you feel comfortable enough with this, and how can we protect so that neither party ends up losing out as part of this process.
Yeah.
And so we ended up reaching a broad consensus on it. And in the state Senate, there are 21 Republicans and 19 Democrats.
Right.
But this passed 40-0 on one vote and 39-1 on the other vote.
Oh,
so they had to have
so
2 votes.
pretty good, yeah.
So we reached broad consensus on it. And I will say that the chair of the Privileges and Elections Committee, who's a Republican, Jill Vogel, she worked very closely with me throughout this whole process. She actually is an election lawyer. So she understood these things very well, because that's part of her profession. But sort of worked with her, and she worked with her Republican colleagues, and I worked with some of them, but also with the Democrats. And we reached a broad consensus on it. And then we had to get the House of Delegates to agree to it, because they had a totally different plan. But in the end, they came around. And actually it was, when it was debated on the floor in the House of Delegates, Chris Jones, who had done the redistricting for the House of Delegates in 2011, stood up and said, this is about as fair a proposal as I've ever seen. This is something we can live with. And so in the end, there was only one Republican that voted against it on the floor of the House there. So now this doesn't mean it's all in place yet, because to pass a constitutional amendment and add something to the Constitution in Virginia, you have to pass it twice in the General Assembly. And there has to be an election for the House of Delegates in between those 2 passages.
Oh, so it has to be passed again next year?
So it has to be passed again next year.
Well,
So-
there will be an election in November.
Yeah, so the next is
Right.
in November,
That's
so we
fine.
will have to pass it again next year.
Right.
And the other provision that we have in our Constitution is that to do a constitutional amendment after it's passed twice in the legislature, then the voters vote on it. And so that will occur in November of next year, assuming we pass it in in the winter. And this is not an automatic thing that the voters approve, but I feel pretty confident they will in this particular case.
So what we have to do is to continue to be educated about this
Yes.
issue, because we will have to vote on it next year.
Right.
I know I've been in touch with several groups who've worked on the grassroots level on gerrymandering in
Right.
Virginia, because some of us have really been bothered
Right.
by it. But at this point, as you were talking, I was wondering, now what is there left to do for us now that the amendment has passed? But education has to be ongoing, correct?
Education is ongoing, and certainly you can provide input to make sure that we do pass it again in 2020. But then the voters will have to be educated, because it has to go to the voters in November of 2020.
Yeah.
And so that will be the opportunity to weigh in there. And there have been a couple of constitutional amendments in recent years that have been defeated by the voters after passing in the legislature. So it's I think in this case, I think we're in good shape for getting it approved by the voters, but we have to make sure that the voters understand why to do it.
And the voters stay alert to it.
Right.
I think the danger is that once you have this passed now, people may lean back and say, okay, this issue is
all
done.
taken care of.
I'm going to focus on something else now. Yeah.
Well, George, what would happen if the Democrats take control of both houses? Do you think they'll still go along with this bill?
Yes, I do. I think we will. I think there's a broad commitment. There are a few Democrats who are a little skeptical on things, and we didn't have unanimity among the Democrats in the House of Delegates on this issue this year. But I think we will be able to go forward with it, because a lot of the Democrats have been talking about this issue, partly because of the grassroots movement that you talked about.
Yeah.
And so that has gotten legislators educated, and legislators, particularly Democratic legislators, have said we need to do something in this, and now have said this is our only chance to get it done. Otherwise, come back in 10 years. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It really sets not only the tone, but the rules for a long time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the voters understanding it, when we drew 3 maps in 2011, and 2 of them the courts threw out, that suggests something's wrong with the process. And so I think it does provide a basis for saying we need to move forward with something that will produce a map that everybody can be comfortable with, and that will be fair to all parties.
Right.
And
but as a voter from the outside, sometimes you wonder what's going on in Richmond, and it's hard to understand.
Yes.
And because you're on the inside.
Right.
There are a lot of intricacies to it, and like you said, you had to go around and find out who has to be pleased which way. We don't know any of that.
Right.
And so you can sit here and think, I don't know whether I really have any input yet in this.
Well, actually, this wasn't in the 2011 redistricting that we did, but in the one previous to that in 2001, the Republicans, in drawing that one congressional district that had as many African Americans as they could find, what they did was they drew a map that had a large African American population in the Richmond area. Then they went down the middle of the James River.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
And then came back on land.
I saw that map. Yeah.
So
that's pretty obvious.
And districts are supposed to be contiguous, which means they're supposed to be all touching. And they were only touching underwater. So there was nobody living down under the James River. But they actually drew the map down about 20 miles going downstream. So.
One potential fly in the ointment, if I might. I talked to some people, and all of the members of the Virginia Supreme Court have been selected by Republicans. Do you think that might have some influence on what they may do if it ever comes to them?
I know a lot of the people who are on the Supreme Court. I feel comfortable that there are good people there that are going to make a fair decision.
Okay.
And make a balanced decision. And one of the people who's on the Supreme Court now is Bill Mims, who was a state delegate and then a state senator from Loudoun County. And so he has been through the political process. And actually in 2001, he drew the Northern Virginia Senate districts, working with the Northern Virginia senators there. And you could argue both sides as to who got helped more out of that process. But in the end, everybody sort of bought into it. But he understands it very well, and he is an extraordinarily balanced and fair-minded person. And I think he will be the leading person on the Supreme Court if it actually had to go there.
If
And
it
I
ever
think
gets there.
if it ever got there. And I think in reality that what the Supreme Court would do is not sit back, particularly on the legislative stuff, because it has to happen fast. They're not going to sit back and try to redraw a map. They're going to look at the maps that have been proposed and pick one. And so, and those would be those that might be proposed within the discussions within the redistricting commission. But also, if there are outside groups that have proposed things, they might look at those as well. But I do feel confident that at the end they don't want to be seen as being partisan.
No, I don't think.
I mean, the Supreme Court wants to be seen as doing justice. So.
Yeah, I also feel that in the long run, they'll vote their conscience rather than their political beliefs, because they are in the highest court in the state.
Yes.
Well, their conscience and their knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a most interesting half hour. Can you believe it's over already?
Already?
Wow,
I could
really?
go on for a while.
I know. I think we've had enough.
Marvin and I could do the next half hour. So.
Okay. You'll stay here. We turn the cameras off.
That's right.
And you celebrate your birthdays.
That's right.
Oh, thank you.
I thank you so much for coming, Senator Barker.
Quite welcome.
He is one of the people whose names you'll see on the ballot in November. And Marvin, because he roams the halls here at Green Spring and is active in all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And happy birthday again.
Thank you.